I'd like to introduce Dr. Brian McQuinn, who is the co-director of the Center for Artificial Intelligence, Conflict and Data, also an assistant professor at the University of Regina, Canada. He's a civil war scholar and a practitioner specializing in conflict resolution training and interventions, whose work in conflict-affected countries over 2 decades has ranged from supporting peace talks in Nepal and Timor-Leste to engaging with armed groups in South Sudan and Nigeria. Dr. McQuinn will talk to us about human-wildlife conflict and coexistence from the peace-building perspective. Yeah. Dr. Brian? Hi.
I'll sneak up behind you.
No, that's fine.
So, in preparing for this, I was watching Alice in Wonderland with my son, and I sort of began to really see a lot of the language, and I've got some quotes that I'll read to you that really help galvanize a lot of what I'm hoping to talk to you about today in that movie. So much of what you do in your training as conservationists and as biologists is very much understanding the field. But the reality is a lot of you got into biology and conservation because you don't actually like human beings and you prefer animals. The problem is halfway through your training and halfway through your work, you realize that actually most of what you need to do now actually involves human beings. And so this familiar world of what you know is now kind of turned upside down. And so all the things that you know and all your training in some ways are not always, it's not that they're not helpful, but there's a whole set of different things that now are necessary for you to be looking at. And you meet a lot of strange people as well, and this is what I also thought of when I was watching this. So ultimately, your job if you're going to deal with a lot of these conflicts is about getting in the middle. And if you know anything about having traveled the world, is almost every culture in the world has some sort of saying or some sort of anecdote for why you ought not to get into the middle. And my favorite one is in Indonesia, where it says, if 2 dogs are fighting, don't get in the middle because otherwise you're going to get bitten. And the fact is, though, this is what you have to do now. And so part of today and part of what I want to talk to you about is how can you actually thrive in the middle, and how can we actually give you, in some ways, this is going to be a crash course in the next 15, 16 minutes, so that you all will be fully trained by the end of this, and we can unleash you onto the world. I know there's professional mediators here, ignore what they're going to say afterwards, don't believe them. You will all be fully trained at the end of all of this. But the fact that you are here, I think, tells us a little bit about, the nature of who wants to come and end up in the middle. Despite all of the advice you get from all the different cultures, you're still here. And it was actually when I heard this in the movie that, well, I shouldn't say it made me think of you, because you're going to hear the quote and why that's probably not a good thing. But I think it is a really good way of grounding a little bit of this talk. And so it is, but I don't want to go among mad people, Alice remarked. Oh, but you can't help that, the cat said. We're all mad here. I'm mad, you're mad. But how do you know I'm mad? You must be, said the cat, or you wouldn't have come here. And so I'm afraid you all might be a little crazy or a little mad to actually want to step into this kind of world. And so what I'm hoping to do is conflict resolution and sort of peace building can all sound very complicated and can all be sort of very messy. And we know this from our experience. But one of the things that is for me always really important is that despite working in conflict zones and doing peace talks and these kinds of seemingly very important things, when I work with conservationists, and one of the greatest honors of my life has been accompanying conservationists over the last 20 years, they always seem very shocked when I tell them, no, in fact, your conflicts are incredibly difficult. They always think, well, you deal with actual war. That must be really difficult. In many ways, the conflicts you deal with have these deep-rooted elements. They don't always, but they often do have these very intractable elements to them. Yes, there may not be sort of, violence at the scale of civil war, but that does not actually make that any easier. And so I say that because I think it's sometimes important that you hear that from the outside, saying it actually is incredibly difficult, and that's why often you find yourself rather frustrated and the situation's kind of not resolving themselves. So the crash course. Before I get into the sort of, we often talk about skills and processes, and it gets very technical, but I would argue that the most important thing that you bring to any situation of conflict is what John Paul Lederach called the moral imagination. And what that is It's the idea that there is another way, that there is the possibility. And I love the quote from, and you can see why I really got into this when I was going through this, but why sometimes I believe as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. So part of the moral imagination is to believe things that are in fact impossible. Now, that sounds really, maybe impossible. But the fact is, one of the things that I love about conflict resolution and about moral imagination, and this is where things get a little awkward, I'm afraid, is that you actually live it every day. Conflict resolution, how you deal with conflict, happens to you every day, depending on your partner, maybe every hour. But it gets very awkward conversation very quickly. But the fact is, you do have to deal with this. And it's not something, unlike sort of biologists or, biology or conservation that happens out there in the field, conflict happens also very much in our own lives. So you get to practice this every day. It's very exciting. But the fact is, if you can't imagine in the conflicts in your life, in your work, in your family, if you can't imagine doing those a different way, why would you expect someone else in a different situation to do the same thing? And so I want to unleash you onto the world of I've been calling, I've got a conflict with you, I really need to talk after this. But in some ways, that's actually what I'm advocating, is that a lot of what we're going to talk about in a little bit is also about doing that in your life. Because that moral imagination is about actually, maybe there is a different way of coming at this. Maybe it actually is possible. We've all had that in our life, where you've had a conflict with someone and something was said a certain way, or you approached it a slightly different way, and all of a sudden, everything shifted. And that is that moral imagination, and being able to come into a situation where people have been in the position that they've been in, they've been saying the same things, that they are stuck, and it is, part of their identity, part of their community's identity. There are genuinely life-threatening situations. The idea that there could be another way is actually really important, and that kind of moral imagination is actually crucial to kind of often just reframing things and having that energy and imagination that's necessary. So, I always like to start, who here is terrified of conflict and avoids it at all cost? Please be honest. So by the end of all of this, after 12 minutes, you are all going to rush into conflict whenever you see it now, okay? That is the goal, and that's my matrix. Speaking of matrix for success, that's my success. Whenever there's conflict now, you'll be like, aha, I remember the talk. This is an opportunity to practice my more imagination and my skills. And so that's kind of what I want you to do. And going back to Alice, I don't see how he can even finish if he doesn't begin. So where do we begin with this? And I'll make this a little bit more interactive because, as you know, facilitators and mediators, we hate talking for too long, and we like to engage with people. So the reason I'm going to talk about this is conflict resolution can seem incredibly complicated, and it is in some ways, because you're in the middle of a situation and it seems like chaos and there's history, and it's like, where do I even start? So part of my job, I think, here today is to try to give you at least a starting point and a couple of concepts and a couple ideas so that you don't get lost when you kind of don't know where to begin. And for all the complexity that exists within the literature and within practice, I would argue that what we're going to do now is kind of sort of boiled down to things that are really essential and things that if you can keep these in mind, you'll probably be okay when you are unleashed into the world. So when you first meet someone, and I'm going to make this very micro, and then you'll see how it sort of telescopes out. When you meet someone who is in conflict and is kind of in the middle of it, describe them to me. And this is not, there's no trick question, this is very simple. Describe them to me. Angry. Tense. You have to yell though. Scared. Aha. I love that you push your hand up, that's so nice. Frustrated. Very good. Uncommunicative. I feel like we need to talk more about that later. Assuming you are a good friend or a good colleague or a good mediator, whatever word you want to use, at the end of having talked with you, you being fully skilled up by the end of these 14 minutes and fully empowered to go into the world, how would you describe the person after you have worked your magic with them? Sorry? Heard? So they've been listened to? Sorry? Open? Again, I feel like there's a little more conversations need to happen. Relaxed.
Optimistic.
Hopeful? Calmer? They probably also have a sense, when you're talking about frustration, of not knowing, before they weren't sure what to do, probably having some clarity as to what they should do next, right? Or at least what's in front of them. I would argue that whether it is a peace process in Nepal, or whether it is dealing with your partner, or dealing with your 5-year-old in my case, that all conflict resolution, whether it's complex, systemic, stakeholder negotiations, or just interpersonal discussions, follow this very simple 2-stage process. The first one is very much, and what do you do actually? I'm going to make you work here for a little while. How do you get that person down to that sort of first part? What do you do? What are the things that you do to get that person from there to there? Listen. How's that? I paid her $5 to do that. But what happens if, this often is the case, and again, I don't want to get into personal relationships, but sometimes when people are there, certain kinds of questions are often about, what are you going to do next? Happen right away, right? As soon as you see someone upset and they say, well, what are you going to do? What's the solution? What happens if you do that when someone is away at the top? And again, I don't want to get into personal lives, so no crying, please. But what happens if you start kind of working for what you should do next at that very beginning point? It can escalate, because then it just gets them, again, I feel like there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes. But sorry? Very much. Resistance. So this idea that you're not meeting them where they are, right? But, okay, let's assume you've done a really good job. What's the second part about? Once you've listened to them, the anger is out, their openness is there, but they've been heard, but what happens next? There has to be a second stage to this. What's that second stage about? Planning. Or options. See, it cost me a lot of money to seed this in the crowd. And I would argue that no matter what conflict resolution process you are talking about in the world, from the most complex to the most simple, always keep in mind this graph. Now, the real problem is when you have multiple people in the same conflict resolution process, and some of them are up there and some of them are down there. Because that's when someone wants to talk about solutions and the other person doesn't feel that they've been heard. And that's when your job becomes a little more difficult, but that's for another conversation. And so I put this up here because I really want to, because these things can seem very complicated, and in some cases they often are, and I'm not talking about the context, because that can get very complicated, but what do you do? Where do you begin? Understanding where you are in this process is crucial. Is there a process that has been put into place? And if there isn't, or if you are thinking about it, this is kind of in large part how you want to think about it, whether it involves communities or otherwise. Where are they on this graph? Can anyone truly be neutral? Are you neutral in most human-wildlife conflicts? No. Now, I know that that's a terrible thing to say in some ways, because in some ways you are often the people who are trying to resolve them. So how do you resolve a conflict when you are in the middle of it and not neutral? And that's part of, there's even a chapter in the guidelines on this. This is pretty essential, because in that process, if you're talking to your friend, you're neutral in that, right? Because you're not involved in the conflict. But if you were one of the conflict actors saying, no, really, I want to know what you feel, they're not going to believe you when you ask them that question. And so one of the big challenges in conservation, and for conservationists, is who is that neutral person? In many places, conservationists can play an incredibly important role in helping start that process, and helping even fund that process, and helping initiate that process. But the idea of leading that process can sometimes get a little bit delicate, because you are often seen as having been, having very distinct outcomes. It doesn't mean that you don't have an incredibly important role in that process we just talked about, but it's always important to understand your positionality in that. So you just invite me, and then we can do some. We can. This just turns into me like getting more work. I don't need that. I take it back. So the other thing that I think is the last sort of piece of this one. How much time do I have? You were supposed to be giving me signals, but someone stopped, didn't give me signals. I didn't pay you enough, apparently. what's actually going on? The other thing that's really challenging is not just the process can be incredibly complicated, what we mean by conflict resolution, but how is it that people can fight so hard out of things that seem so insignificant to you, maybe? Or why is it that, some people are saying this and others? The complexity of conflict can sometimes be overwhelming. And so part of my job in any situation, but especially here today, is to try to kind of give a few tools that just help you kind of make sense of things. Do they encompass all possible complexity? Absolutely not. But sometimes in conflict, when things seem overwhelming, it's important to hold on to a few threads that you have to ground yourself as to what's going on. Very simple example, and only because you've been so wonderfully engaging, I'm going to keep doing this. In a car accident, and this again is not a trick question, what's the conflict? Who pays? Fixing the cars, who pays, okay? A very obvious dispute, very simple. Now imagine the same car accident, except the two people who get out of the car have been recently divorced, and it didn't go well. I feel like this is going to become a therapy session very quickly. Is there more energy or less energy, or more potential for conflict or less potential for conflict? This is usually when someone screams at this point. Why? History. History, past conflict that has not been deeply involved. So we talk about that as being underlying conflict. Now I'll give an example of the former Yugoslavia. During the war, the three different communities had separate license plates. So Croat, Serb, and Bosniak. They actually, each community had their own license plates on their cars, which is a whole other discussion. So imagine the same car accident now, when people get out of the cars and they see a different license plate. Let's say it's just at the end of the war. So I assume you went, ooh. Is there more potential or less potential for conflict? Now, there's a very good chance, because it's former Yugoslavia, they got out and were the best of friends before the war and embraced each other and said, I haven't seen you in a few years. But the odds are not that that's going to be the case. But the odds are they don't know each other, but you all went instinctively. Why? God, it's so good to spend so much money on you. That's what we call deep-rooted or identity-based conflict. Is identity something that's easy to change? Is most of the programs you do and try to implement in communities about changing people's identity? About how they go, what livelihoods they have, or how they are connected to the land, or how they're connected to. There's often a big part of that that has identity, at least to them, has identity dimensions. And I say that only because it is always important to understand kind of where you are working at. And so we talk about dispute underlying and sort of deep-rooted or identity-based conflict. Where is the conflict that you are engaging with situated there? Most of the time, you only ever see the dispute, because that's what people are actually fighting about, compensation programs. But the fact is that gorilla or that elephant might be seen as the government's gorilla or the government's elephant, which goes back to having been kicked out of that land at some point. So that's about the underlying, let alone about, in the case of Canada, where there was a dispute over whether a golf course should be extended by 9 holes. They just wanted to extend it to a few more acres of land. What's the problem? Well, that turned out to be the burial land of the indigenous people of that area. So for half of the people, it was just like, we want to build some more golf courses. What's the problem at the dispute? But for the others is, you've been kicking out of land and massacring us for the better part of 250 years. So very similar to the process of where someone is in that, people can also very much be at different levels of conflict. And that's where you often have people talking past each other. What's always crucial to remember is that the processes you use to deal with those disputes are quite different than the processes you use to deal with underlying conflict, and are different again than the processes you use to deal with identity. And the real issue is, and this is where we see this over and over and over again, as conservationists, you are often focused on the disputes because that's what's immediately available. Like, that's what the problem is, right? What's the problem? The problem is this thing. Okay, let's fix this thing. But if you have underlying and deep-rooted conflicts going on in that conflict, what are the odds that that dispute is going to be replaced by another dispute in about 5 minutes? Pretty high. And so the question becomes, are you solving the right problem? And I go back to Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, where the world that you knew as, field people, I understand animals, I understand all of a sudden gets turned upside down, and now you become mediators. You were not trained for this. Well, you will be now. You can say you are now. You can put it on your CV. But then all of a sudden, all of these other human processes, this mediation, multi-stakeholder negotiation, dialogue, all of a sudden kick in. And this is where partnering with other people who have a bit more of that experience, either as other conservationists or other organizations, allows you to be able to say, what level am I working at and what kind of processes? But does that mean you have to solve every problem in the world? Like, are you going to have to solve the indigenous communities and their history of genocide in a particular country? No, but at some point, if you just deal with the dispute, that's also not sustainable. Welcome to why your jobs and your vocation is so difficult. Because you have to decide where along that scale are you actually going to try to address the problem. I've been doing this for a very long time, and I'm very old, but it's hard in a context of pure conflict to know where to do that, let alone when you're trying to accomplish a bunch of other things simultaneously. I don't want to make you despondent at the end of this, but it's mostly just to kind of also realize how challenging some of what you do is, and why it's not necessarily obvious. So, I do this because ultimately what you are doing in these situations, there is the analysis of understanding where you are, there is a process that needs to be put into place and designing it as such, and then often getting some help or someone for that process to be a bit neutral. Because the one thing is that while you may not be neutral, a process can be a bit more neutral, and you can often have people who will support you through that. But that this is kind of what you always need to keep in your mind. Everything will get complicated, and it is important that the nuance is there. But it's also important to make sure that you have the big pieces in place, because that's actually where success usually comes from. So the best way to explain it is to do it. So I say that in two ways. One is in your life. I know it's strange, but actually it's not that different in some ways to deal with some of the conflicts in your own life and to be able to try, because in some ways you are going to be asking people to do exactly the same thing in your work. So if you can't do it, you also need to be clear on how other people, but also when you do it yourself and realize, oh, maybe it's not so bad. So that by the end of all this, whenever you see a conflict, I want you all just running straight for it as a form of practice. And so we'll see how that goes, but I'm sure it won't end badly. And so the other thing too is that we're actually doing a session tomorrow where we might need a few facilitators. And so if a few of you are interested, please, I think we need 5 or 6, come talk to me afterwards, and we can actually do some of this stuff a little. I'll do like a little mini training, I guess. I wouldn't quite call it that, but like a 10-minute talk to be able to start doing on this. So I leave you with the thought that what you do is extraordinary, and the challenge of what you do now is, as people who were trained to do one thing, but find that actually there's a whole suite of other ideas and social processes that you now need to become engaged with and understand in order to do the thing that you love most. And so my heart goes out to you. We are here to support you. That's why in some ways we have this conference, and that you're all probably a little bit mad for actually being here, but it's usually more fun. Okay? Thanks. There's no questions. There's no questions. Questions aren't allowed. I'm done.
No, please hold on. Thank you, Brian, for that talk. And I would recommend we all become musicians or bakers, because it is disheartening many a time. Yeah. But questions, please.
Good. Thank you.
There.
See.
Thank you for the training.
Kind of like a mini training. That's how I kind of thought about it.
Well, I'm learning things about conflict in this conference, and I learned as well that the conflict has a high point. There is a point that everything is really, really bad. So I wonder, and also that a conflict can be an opportunity to act and to change. So is there a general rule? Would you address it at the peak? Would you want to avoid getting to the peak? Or?
So you're talking about cycles of conflict, but there's a wonderful term that John Paul Lederach also talked about. It's conflict transformation. You'll hear this more now and more because of some of the work of different organizations. The idea of conflict transformation ultimately, and having worked with John Paul Lederach, I was very lucky to kind of understand a lot of his thinking. It really is, if you remember the disputes, conflict transformation is really using a dispute as an opportunity to get at some of the underlying issues. Because you can't normally get at underlying conflict unless you have an excuse. And the interesting thing with conservation, you have very difficult conflicts, but they're usually always there. So you can actually you have an excuse to start getting at some of the underlying issues. And I realize I'm not directly answering your point, but this idea that conflict as an opportunity or disputes as an opportunity to try to get at things that are below is actually how we start to do more sustainable solutions. And so when, at what point, obviously it's, if it's so hot that that the tempers are at that level, if you just go back to I use that graph and the example of the individual, because if someone is like crying and screaming that they're so angry, you give them a moment, right? You don't just be like, hi, I'm here to listen to you. Or at least it doesn't work. I have scars actually from, that didn't work out for me. So it's understanding. So it's, in some ways, it's like the micro and the macro often have very similar sort of rhythms to them. And so you wouldn't do it with an individual, so why would you do it in a situation? But at the same time, that dispute is that opportunity to get at some of those underlying, because you have an excuse to talk to people, right? Because randomly walking into a place, hi, I'd like to talk about conflict. Super creepy, super creepy. It's not something you can do. I've tried. So that's why it's the excuse, because you talk about the one thing that people are willing to talk about, but in listening, all of a sudden, all these other things come tumbling out about why, what's happened in the past. And that's when you start to be able to move down that curve, but also through the levels of conflict. The man with the very long arm. Oh, the exercise in all of this.
Thank you, Brian. That was wonderful. And I want this so much in my work. I want a peaceful resolution, and I want to see the parties come together and work together. How important is it to get both sides to agree to that? And how do you find that person that's going to be the right person to do that? Because I'm probably not at this point.
Yeah. Two really crucial questions they're basically process questions, right? One of the most important things about a process is that it has to be voluntary. And this is often the distinction between a consultation and a dialogue. Because consultation is, we have all the power, we want to hear what you're going to say. You have no decision-making power, and it's very clear. We're going to listen to what you say. We cannot decide. And this is often why you get so much pushback in consultations, because the power is very clear. By definition, third-party processes or conflict resolution processes, it is voluntary for everyone, and they have the choice whether to, at any point, leave. Therefore, they are empowered in that. And then in some ways, you are shifting the power. And this is where, and I'll be very honest with you, with conservation, it's very difficult, right? The idea that you're going to give the power of what's going to happen to certain species into communities, and it's their decision. This is where that, but if you empower people, if that is clear, that because the fact is they have the power to sabotage and to be spoilers. So there is power there in recognizing that. So that is part of that conciliation process, is of actually talking to them about what you're going to do, and who you identify as being in that process, who you identify as that neutral, is probably one of the main stumbling blocks for whether they agree. And so going to them saying, hey, and this is the one thing that you can always use for the answer to that is, do you want this situation to continue, or are you open to trying to find another way? And if the answer to that is yes, I'm not happy with the way it is now, I'd like to find another way, you have your first hook. Now the question becomes, what would that way look like? I don't know. But once you have that hook, then it becomes them co-developing a process. Well, who would be the right person? And obviously the different sides are going to have different ideas, but in that negotiation you can get teams that often have people who are perceived to be what are often called inside neutrals or insider neutrals, where it's someone who they kind of know and trust, and you get one from both sides and they work together as a team. Okay? I think there was a second part of the question, but I'm still very sleep deprived, so I don't remember what it was. But we can talk after, sorry. Please.
Which I've done.
Just like an oxymoron. Oh, this is live. I shouldn't say that. Yes, please.
In dealing with UN conflict resolution, we have a form that we use, and we're often in the field, and there is no person who's a third-party neutral on site when you have to work quickly on something, and especially sometimes who you think is neutral isn't, and they're just as biased as anyone else. And I was wondering, we often put a form or something that's like a blank piece of paper or something in the table to allow people to create a third-party neutral with something that is innocuous as some kind of storyboard or form
It's
of
a
what
process.
they'd like to
The
see.
process is neutral.
And I was wondering if you have tools that do not use other parties that still achieve that in difficult situations.
Because the fact is, who can afford and have and who wants someone like me around, right? And so there are other ways of doing it that aren't, but conceptually, it's important that you distinguish. It's not you doing it, it's you now putting a process, in this case, whether it's a tool or kind of an interesting way, that's actually a process, and then you're kind of stepping back from it, right? And you're not controlling it. It's not like, hey, give me this, I'll evaluate what it is. And so that's why this is important, is that you should be saying, haha, I'm not neutral, how do I create a slightly more neutral process, just conceptually? And that's one of the solutions, is exactly as you said. So when you do it next time, it's like, it's not me doing it, it's like a process. And just understanding that, because then maybe where it goes and who then looks at it and how you end up sort of building on that, if you look at it from a neutral process, well, who actually should be doing that? Maybe I just started, I initiate it, and then actually we involve other people. And so just thinking in those terms is actually what helps you might maybe build that forward. Because the fact is, you can't always have someone come. So how do you create that? For example, we understand that there's a bunch of people who are all involved in this. What if we take one person from all of them, bring them together, and they become the sort of committee that helps us with this process? So it becomes like a self-generated or a self-managed process with all the key stakeholders who are kind of all have a stake in it then, right? And they also have information, because whatever's being decided will go back to the various different stakeholders. And so then it becomes sort of a self-managed or a self-conflict resolving process. Because that's frankly what, not everyone has the resources to bring in people. Right.
Question there.
And I can talk afterwards. Someone over there was a hand.
Hello, thank you, that was really interesting. Slightly existential question. Do you think there is a satisfactory resolution for all conflicts?
Thank you. And that was your second half of your question. So now I remember. Thank you. This is going to be slightly controversial for my peace-building friends, so if there's any of you in the room, I'm sorry in advance. I don't like the word peace, and that shouldn't be the goal in most circumstances, because peace is like conflict is bad, right? And the fact is, the very nature of what you do is intrinsically going to drive conflict, because there are very different interests, very different needs, and they are not all going to happen at the same time, and not everyone is going to be satisfied. So my problem sometimes with the word peace is the idea, well, if we just work hard enough, everything will go away and everything will be happy. That will never happen, especially in these circumstances. So I would rather you become comfortable with conflict and see conflict as an opportunity, but to realize that our job is not to resolve conflict, but to build systems that will continually manage conflict over time in a way that is sustainable and that creates sustainable solutions. The sustainable solution has to have a conflict resolution mechanism built into it, because otherwise the next time there's a problem, everything starts over again. And so this is where, and maybe if you want to call that peace, fine, but to me it's often the wrong way of thinking about it. Is how do we ensure, we accept conflict, and conflict is an opportunity to continue to work on these things and build new processes and include more people and find ways of ensuring that over time we have these mechanisms that will deal with these things over time. Because things change.
You'll have to catch
Yeah, that was the worst clap ever, but I deserve that, I understand.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Brian, for the lovely talk.